Okay, so welcome everyone to the latest talk in the of the RACS network. Today we're joined by Dr. Bruce Damer and Matt Segall. So Matthew Segall, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, is assistant professor in the Philosophy, Cosmology, and Consciousness program at the California Institute of Integral Studies in San Francisco, California. He's the author of Physics of the World Soul, Whitehead's Adventure in Cosmology, published in 2021, and I'll include links to those books in the description. And Crossing the Threshold: Etheric Imagination in the Post-Kantian Process Philosophy of Schelling and Whitehead, that's forthcoming. And he's a multidisciplinary researcher focusing on applications of process philosophy across the natural and social sciences, and he blogs regularly at footnotes-to-plato.com. And then Dr. Bruce Damer, again, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly.
Yes.
He's BIOTA Institute Director and Chief Scientist. He spent his life pursuing two great questions. How did life on Earth begin? And how can we give that life and ourselves a sustainable pathway into the cosmos? He conceived of BIOTA, and I'll include links to BIOTA. In fact, once I finished, Bruce maybe tell us a little bit about BIOTA in 1996 and guided it through its first 2 decades of evolution, in which it hosted 4 conferences and a podcast hosted by Tom Barbalet on the use of digital spaces to simulate evolution in natural systems, a decade of scientific research with his collaborator, Professor David Deamer at the UC Santa Cruz Department of Biomolecular Engineering, resulted in the hot spring hypothesis for an origin of life, published in the journal Astrobiology in 2019. In 2021, with growing global collaboration around the hypothesis, he determined that BIOTA was ready for its new mission, raising grants for students and young scientists to test this scenario for life's origins and explore its implications for humanity. Dr. Damer also has a long career working with NASA on mission simulation and design, and recently co-developed a spacecraft to utilize resources from asteroids. He is an avid collector of vintage computing hardware in his DigiBarn Computer Museum and enjoys a fine line with his partner, Catherine Lucas. 3 cats and a fine life with his partner, Catherine Lucas, 3 cats and 1 adorable chihuahua in their Gandalf-inspired house high up in the Santa Cruz redwoods. So, Bruce and Matt, maybe Bruce, tell us a little bit about BIOTA, but then over to you for your talk.
Yeah, BIOTA is a freestanding institute. We're connected to UC Santa Cruz, NASA, and others, and we carry out the actual testing of this hypothesis. So we have a series of students that are either in the undergraduate, graduate, or postgraduate phase, and we go out to hot springs and we do lab work and we do computational simulations. And so it's a grand hypothesis, and it needs decades of testing. So that's what BIOTA does, and hopefully builds careers along the way. And so with that, I shall, let's see, there we go. Start us off here. So can everyone see this?
Yep.
So this is actually an updated bit of things added from our talk from the Exo Philosophy Conference in Salem, which was in May. But we've updated it with some new content, new ideas. And it's called The Cosmological Context of the Origin of Life. This is Matt's title, and I think I'm hoping that I do a good job in linking the origin of life to a cosmological context, at least as a jumping off point for Matt to really land it, in a sense. I'm not a philosopher, I'm a computer scientist, but I work in chemistry and geology and complexity theory. And so how we're going to frame this event of the origin of life within a cosmological context is in 3 parts: empirical, conjectural, and metaphysical. So let's get started. So what I've added to the talk, because I noticed in the RACS YouTube videos there were was quite a bit on life in the universe and our place in the universe. And I just wanted to add this little section that we started to add to our talks, which is in memoriam for Frank Drake, who, as you know, created the famous Drake equation, and he passed away. He's a colleague over at the SETI Institute. I've met him on many occasions, and he passed away about a month ago, I think about 6 weeks ago. So this is a little bit of a dedication to Frank Drake. And of course, Frank Drake, creating the very famous Drake equation in the mid-60s, which posits the inventory of worlds where we might find an extraterrestrial intelligence that we can detect or even try to contact. And along the way, you have the percentage of planets, the sustainable environment for life, and this very key fraction of suitable planets where life actually appears. And we're putting some definition around this now, because it's sort of been presumed that, well, bacteria or microbes just emerge, and it's been kind of a dark hand-waving area for the field. And now we're actually getting a framework around it. So we'll actually go through that in this talk. That's actually the central focus of this talk. And that, of course, leads to the fraction of worlds where complex life can emerge, et cetera, et cetera. So just briefly, we coined a new term to define this framework on which worlds and under what conditions can life begin, and that is urability. And it's from the German for or early. And habitability is a term you all know, which is the worlds that can sustain life as we know it. But urability is on which worlds can life actually start. And this was published in the journal Astrobiology in July. And here we have the TRAPPIST-1 system where, some of these worlds may be habitable, but some of them may be urable, where life could begin and perhaps spread between these worlds. So the new term from the German earliest or first, and you know this from the city of Ur in Sumeria. And Urschleim, Ernest Haeckel's description of the primordial slime. So we felt that was a good STEM word to use. This was the article, and you can look it up. So on to the first section, empirical. What are the plausible scenarios with supporting experimental evidence surrounding the mystery of how life originated on Earth and elsewhere? Well, what's happening is that there was for the last 30 years, this sense that life had to emerge in the oceans. It had to emerge in chemical disequilibria at hydrothermal vents in the bottom of the ocean. You've always seen those black smokers and white smokers on documentaries. But recently, the field has undergone a paradigm shift back to freshwater pools on land. And this actually is kind of chaos in our field right now, but it opens opportunities for collaborations between philosophers and scientists whenever there's kind of a chaotic moment like there was with the birth of quantum mechanics in the 1920s. And we call back to our original sort of father of this question, Charles Darwin, who in a letter in 1871, a letter to his friend Hooker, wrote, the very famous expression, what if, and a big what if we could conceive in some warm little pond somewhere that life can begin. And he actually got the components right. Ammonia, phosphoric salts, light, heat, electricity, etc. And no one really knows the second part of the sentence, in the public at least. He talks about a protein compound was chemically formed, ready to undergo still more complex changes. And this is a breathtaking insight for a 19th century man, because a protein compound is a polymer, and it codes for tasks in the cell, and it has to be formed somehow in this warm little pond and become more complex, i.e. through cycles, grow in length, get more coding, more coded instructions within it, et cetera, a breathtaking description of away from equilibrium thermodynamics in the 19th century. So again, forming polymers and moving the system to go not down to equilibrium, but away from equilibrium. So this is where we think the warm little pond actually would have been. A hot spring pool in a Hadean volcanic landmass 4 billion years ago, which would be pulsed by regular infusions of water, chemical energy from below, organics fed from the sky, and we'll kind of go through how that all works. So the 21st century warm little pond from Charles Darwin is a hot little cycling pool. So a progenitor, which is the environment in which life can emerge, it looks like this thing on the right. This is phospholipid placed in a single drop under a microscope, and it is getting hydrated and moving around, and membranes are forming, sheaths are forming, protocells are budding off. And it's a complex medium. And if you grind up a piece of an ancient meteorite from the time of potentially of when life was forming, this kind of material immediately spontaneously forms. So we believe that synthesis of the organics came from the solar system. It was delivered by infall, accumulated on land, underwent cycling, was processed away from equilibrium such that protein compounds could form. And the initial units that are on the way to life are called protocells, and they contain these polymers, and they can then be subject to selection. Seems like sort of a simple scenario, but it took 25 years to develop. So what you have to get in order to get life from the background of this jumble of molecules in a hot little cycling pool is you need to have a selection. You need to have a combinatorial engine, i.e. that takes, if you see A, B, C, D on the left, protocells, which are lipid membrane-bounded compartments that have polymers and other molecules in them, subject to selection in a kind of roulette wheel, where some of them are selected for function, and then they can be amplified. So it's not natural selection, we call it combinatorial selection, but you have to have an engine to do this thing, to move toward a living system. So that's the fundamental principle. So what we've empirically demonstrated over about 2 decades is that if you subject these little warm ponds or hot pools to hydration and dehydration, you concentrate all the material with the lipid, it forms the polymers through what are called condensation reactions in between layers of lipid. You can see dehydration down on the bottom. And then if you add a drop of water back, it will bud off these compartments, which contain random sets of polymers. And then they dry down again, and they end up in a gel phase, which we think is the network phase, where life can basically boot up through this aggregated network phase. So this has been demonstrated again and again, and it's now a predominant method in science to do prebiotic chemistry. So there's not a week that goes by without a paper that uses this technique that Dave Deemer pioneered, my colleague at UC Santa Cruz. There's me doing the first field demonstration in Rotorua, New Zealand, at a hot spring, using our vials and cycling them through wet and dry in the hot spring conditions, using hot spring water, and using a range of nucleotides to form RNA strands and to form polymers. And the result you can actually see in the bottom of the vial, there's the layer of dried nucleotide and lipid. And in there, nucleotides are getting together and forming long chains without the use of an enzyme. What an amazing thing. No enzymes because you don't have life yet. And then you can form chains as long as several thousand chain lengths of nucleotides. And there's the product from the hot spring on the right and the product from the laboratory work on the left. And we're actually getting multi-hundred mer RNA from its building blocks. Nature's Lego at work. And so you can do this. You can not only self-assemble RNA, but also DNA can self-assemble in these conditions, and peptide-like short polymers of amino acids, all in these hydrothermal conditions. And there's an atomic force microscope image of some of the rings that are formed with the RNA from these experiments. And in RNA, in AFM terms, or in nucleotide terms, you can only form a ring structure like this from a nucleic acid. So this was work done by our colleagues at the University of Copenhagen. This is the most recent work. This is at Fly Geyser in Nevada in the USA. And we went out there with the BBC actually to record a documentary, but we're able to do some more science. And here we've been doing the dry down cycles directly on slides. And what you can see there is a film of nucleotides and basically silica coming out of solution, forming this protective matrix. Just directly visually, you can see the silica in the center. And if we wet dry cycle this material, we capture the polymers we made in the hot spring conditions. And so on the right is a stained fluorescent protocell that contains nucleotides, or rather nucleic acids. So this is the formation of what we're calling a progenitor, which is capable of supporting the emergence and testing of protocells that can occur in these hydrothermal environments. So that's the empirical. Now we jump off into the speculative, which is that where our science has left off and where there's much work to be done. So the question here is the physiochemical artifact the potential progenitor of life and all the processes it can undergo sufficient to transform self-assembling protocells into the first microbial communities? That's the chasm, that's the gap that has to be crossed, that was somehow crossed on the early Earth. And this is a question where I was very attracted to work with Matt, which is our methodological and philosophical tools and frameworks up to the task of reifying this progenitor and entering into the complexity chasm of molecular evolution toward life. Like, how do we philosophically pin the progenitor, in our cosmology? And does the progenitor teach us something? Is it related? Because can the progenitor, this medium and this algorithm, transform how we think about complex emergence itself? So this is combinatorial selection happening, wet, dry, and moist, testing our protocells for stability. And where we jump off is we predict that we now have shown stability, but can we, through iterative cycles in the lab or in hot springs, show the emergence of pore formation, of metabolic cycles, of catalysts? All these are the functions of a living system through a form of proto-evolution that leads up to a quasi-gene, which then can template and produce copies of polymers that do specific jobs that are selected for. And this is the work we're starting with our next student in January, Povilas, coming from Lithuania. He's going to work on templating RNA off DNA to demonstrate that we can do non-enzymatic templating and replication of polymers in these conditions, generating sort of the direction toward Darwinian selection. So this is our jump off point. And all the way at the end, when you've got all these components working as a machine in a protocell, the protocell one day learns to divide itself and push all the contents into daughter compartments, and then you have the transition to the living world. So this is the great philosophical and technical chasm that life had to cross. So putting it all together, this is our central figure from our astrobiology article. A lot of input from geologists and cosmochemists in the astrobiology community. Synthesis of a lot of the organics in the early solar system, which now have been demonstrated with the sample return missions from the asteroids, that they do contain these organics. Depositing them into the landscape. If they land in the ocean, they become diluted and not available for chemistry. Accumulating and concentrating in little ponds everywhere on the basaltic landscape, in interconnected pools, where organics can start getting together into membranous structures. In a particular pool that might be on a regular periodic cycle, the engine, sort of the engine of creation, can get started. And as we've talked about. And then what the engine generates is robust communal masses of protocells that are subject to distribution, so they can start distributing across the landscape to other pools with different conditions, different resources, and share their protogenetics with other progenote masses. And in this way, this sort of cross bridge of evolution happens toward the living world. And then when you get to the transition to self-dividing protocells into freestanding microbes, still within a communal complex, you get even more robustness because you get lineal descent of genes, and you get specialization. So you get energy collectors at the top of the microbial mat and detritus eaters at the bottom, which we see today in places like Yellowstone. And then when you have a robust microbial mat system, you have colonization possible even down at the seashore, which is an extremophile environment with a lot of salt and high tides, and not a good place for life to start, but a good place for it to spread. And the rock record, which I'm showing on the left, bears this out. So on the top, you see this striated mineral called geyserite, discovered in Australia in 2014, which is evidence for a hot spring. At 3.5 billion years ago, in the Dresser Formation in Australia, a hot spring, which contains evidence for life on land as far back as we can now look. So the land was not dead with life crawling out of the oceans. It was where life began, and then adapted, became robust, and could spread. The next little piece of rock there on the left is a lakeshore stromatolite, which is microbial mats that sequester sand grains and grow through them, piled up by wave action at a lakeshore. This is about 2.7 billion years old. And then the bottom one is a large domical stromatolite, which is rock evidence of microbes in a big tower that would have formed at a marine shore. And you can still see these at various places on the Earth, these can grow up to 3 meters in height. And they're microbial communities, the oldest evidence for life on Earth. So we put the proposal out in 2015, and the discovery of the stromatolites in the hot spring sort of catapulted it into the world stage. And Scientific American ran a cover story in 2017 where they depicted this scenario as this sort of spiral going through wet, dry, and moist, which is quite a good way to look at it. And things get more complex as they get further out. And then, as Richard mentioned, in 2019, 2020, astrobiology published the main hot spring hypothesis, and that's only 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago. And nature has sort of come in and weighed in on this issue as the controversy and the shouting matches around a paradigm shift happen in science, as Thomas Kuhn wrote about all the way back in the 60s. And so this was one of the articles in 2020 where the proponents of the hot spring, of the ocean vent origins, were having being criticized by our colleagues actually in this article. You can look it up. It's called the water paradox. So the implications for herbal worlds are pretty big. This has a huge impact on NASA and the whole astrobiology exoplanet community. And this want to roll back to 2007 when the Spirit rover discovered not what looked like snow on Mars, because you can't have snow on Mars because the atmosphere is so thin and desiccating, but opaline silica. So this is silicate minerals at this location at Columbia Hills. And they realized they were looking at a hot spring 3.7 billion years old. And these are rocks that are sort of indicative of what are called digitate sinters. And so the proposal that this is probably the closest evidence we have to life outside of the Earth at this point. But the proposal is that we can now say there's a formalism that to start any form of life using any chemistry, because you could ask yourself, could you start life on Mars with Mars's chemistry, which is similar to Earth 4 billion years ago, but had a lot more iron? But the same access to water and organics, but could you start life on Titan, which is all cryogenic? But our answer is that we can't define life, but we can define perhaps how life must start, that it must require polymers with encapsulation and combinatorial selection, and that aqueous carbon chemistry is a really strong attractor for that. So that life could start on early Mars and other similar herbal worlds, but it can't start on ocean worlds because ocean worlds don't have exposed landscapes. They don't have any kind of cycling energy system. There's no way to collect organics. There's no way to synthesize organics in a dilute ocean, even if it did have a hydrothermal system in it. So these worlds are inurable. So they can't start life, but they could sustain life. So bacteria took a ride. They might be able to survive somewhere in the oceans if they had an energy source. So now we're going to jump to the metaphysical. This is less in my department, more of Matt's, but I'll just power through this from my perspective as a scientist, as an experimentalist. The question is, can we derive linkages between the empirical and actual progenitor, i.e. this medium that life can start in, and the process and organic thought of Whitehead and others? And can this linkage help guide the next steps of our science? And a laboratory, can we provide a laboratory process philosophical environment? So really what it comes down to is the progenitor environment is the environment that can carry self-assembled protocells across an evolutionary chasm between physics and biology, this sort of mysterious transit. And if you want to think about it in abstract terms, physics may be thought of, at least not at the level of quantum dynamics, but the level of classical chemistry systems and planetary geology, as a wave that if you push down on it, it has a predictable outcome, at least at that scale. And within that wave emerges a new phenomenon, the semi-permeable membrane compartment. And that phenomenon has properties that didn't exist in the universe before. It has the property of letting things in and out selectively, and of things going between compartments. And if you get a lot of these compartments together, they can spontaneously form something called a network, nodes with symbolic material passing between nodes. And this is new. This doesn't really exist anywhere in geology, in stellar processes, in cosmochemistry. This is new. This idea of concentrating everything together such that it can enter into a flow state. So this mass, this aggregate of these nodes has the property to shape probability, because it just it's common sense. If you get things closer together, they're more likely to interact. So probability, the power of it shaping improbable reactions into reality increases. It shapes interconnection. It shapes the ability of networks to form, and then it allows the emergence of one new property, which is templating information between generations, linear information. This is what we'll be starting work on in January. So it has these three highly potent properties together. And what those properties give you is a kind of an engine that, while it shapes probability initially to get the things together to make improbable things actual, it can then share the results of those improbable occurrences, in Whitehead's term, occasions even, in a network, in a continuously bonded together network, and then template them or remember them in a memory system that then drives future probabilistic outcomes. So this is the core algorithm, if you will, that we predict was operating to affect abiogenesis. So is this a unique occurrence in the universe? Is life a unique occurrence in the universe? And I would say that yes, it adds the internetworking ability and the symbolic and the blueprinting traits that allow life to express greater creative potential from what came before. So the universe effectively is a 2-cycle engine. It's like a motorcycle engine, on, off, on, off, on, off. Stars form, blow up, create new things, then a new star forms, but there's no information in between. So it's kind of, there's compositional memory, but no linear memory. But when biology enters the picture, there is a linear memory that basically instructs the future form to emerge from a more complex set of templated instructions. So let's now look at how it might all go together. The question we can now pose, perhaps, is there a through line from cosmogenesis, the origin of the universe, through to biogenesis, and then perhaps even to conscious genesis? And this is a little sculpture, a little piece of artwork that I drew a couple of years ago to try to put it all into one context, into a cosmological context. So driven by cycles of energy, and the primary cycle of energy is the sun hitting the earth on a periodic basis and pulsing high quality energy into the system, initially with wet dry cycling, forming your polymers, and then eventually with a kind of photosynthesis to capture the energy in much more direct way. And we have plants that feed us. That this is a cycling system that comes out of the Big Bang, because you have gravity and you have planets forming around stellar systems. And you have the origin of life because of this cycling system, this rotational system. This is sort of the parameter that now we're able to put around it. So you have the emergence of microbial communities, and then the continuous stacking of complexity through this pulsing of energy is driving them to higher states of complexity. You have animals emerge after a very, very long period of time through, in a sense, a set of very unlikely events, but eventually they do. Nervous systems, which allow learning and changing the organism in the lifetime of the organism, which lead to, this is an emergentist approach, would lead to self-awareness. You get enough nerves together and enough evolution, and then you have consciousness. You get enough of that emerge. But alongside all this is what you see sort of in the middle here. You see this, you see PIM, probability shaping, interconnection and memory. You get this enormous field of material, of interconnections that are going on at the level of the cell, the level of hormones in the atmosphere, transits even through the air, through microbiota, and the collection of an immense number of genes that are constantly expressing and constantly being templated. And you have this field, in a sense, emerging. You have electrical effects as things pass through membranes. You have a dense network of interconnectives. So the eye gets very dense. Therefore, the probability, and the eye is packed with information, therefore the power for the system to shape its future is increased constantly. So that's sort of the single view. And is this all the experience? Is this the experiential substrate that we live in, that we're connected to? Is this what is effectively sort of mind at large, as Aldous Huxley talked about back in the day? So that's a question, but just because this is RACS and you're interested in sort of our place in the universe, a question we can now also pose is, how does the origin of cellular life factor into the rise of complex multicellular life in a technological species? This transition here, the response is, with this errability framework and with this proposed scenario for how life can begin, we can actually now constrain the worlds and the errable worlds into which life can emerge. And we find that the conditions are fairly rare, but the crossing of that chasm from those flimsy protocells to robust living cells is difficult. It's perhaps as challenging as the rise of complex animal life later, animal and plant life, and that perhaps microbes are hard, not easy. And if microbes are hard, there's a much lower inventory of worlds with life on them. And one thing to understand is that a place like Mars died. Mars is inerrable today. Mars could not start life today. It could sustain life in the rocks, in hot, wet rocks, but a life that has no evolutionary future. So perhaps most life in the universe is microbial, trapped in rock, where there's a sterilizing surface, or where there's a planetary ocean, for example, but there is no cycling, there's no ability for that life to grow in complexity. So life may be rarer, and certainly complex life would be very much more rare in that circumstance. And I just peppered the end of this talk with some questions, or actually points or questions that came from our article chapter for a book being published out of the Salem meeting. I just tried to shorten them down a little bit, but this could be prime the pump for talking. So I'll just quickly, you can just quickly read them, but for the audience, I'll go through them. So one of the questions is, and this comes from Matt and from his work with Whitehead, are the matter and energy engaged in the process of living organisms something truly different than what came before? Or is biological life a less remarkable phenomenon and more of a step in a continuum beyond the previous creative assemblages of the prebiotic cosmos? So that's a big, beefy one. The next one, if so, in a sense, if life is a remarkable extension, or if life is on a continuum, how does the progenitor recast our understandings of organisms as indivisible sets of units in densely interconnected relationship? So if life didn't start as individuals in competition, red in tooth and claw, survival of the fittest, but as a network of an indivisible network, a communal complex, that's a really different recasting of this whole thing. That's a philosophical and a spiritual, in a sense, transformative recasting, and it will come from hard science in this decade as we do more work. Third question is, does life have a pinpoint origin or a wide field origin? I.e., if life is considered a rare event, chance and necessity, it's considered a rare, freakishly rare event of a combination of, say, some polymers and the right thing, and there's a replicator, and somehow life takes off. That's a very narrow point. That's a one-off. And that's philosophically very different than in terms of life's connection to its emergence, than a wide field event where you need an entire landscape with pools, connection to the sky, to the cosmochemistry, to the inputs. And you need a dense interactive system, a wide field system, in which basically the entire Earth has to be in relationship with the formation event of the solar system over a long period of time. And then all the materials moving around between millions of locations, and the entire landscape is the emergence. So the planet is emerging life rather than this pinpoint rare event in a pool. Big juicy question. Next one is, so that actually impacts whether life's emergence and subsequent evolution is in continuous and indivisible connection with the cosmos. And the last three, while the behavior, this is just sort of a point that just sort of came to me when I think about conditions on Mars versus Earth. While the behavior of biological cells in a freshwater pool are remarkably different from static grains of ancient dust still orbiting our star, or grains on the surface of Mars where there's no life, there's a deep and underlying uninterrupted connection between them. So that's positing this cosmological context. Next, can we gain an understanding of the nature of conscious experience, including our most inexplicable and extraordinary states, by scaling up the fundamental processes operating at the earliest stages of life's origin? I.e., if it's PIM all the way down, probability, interconnection, and memory, how does that, is that a lens that we can look through? Because that's still what's operating. You know, we're here in a Zoom session, and the Zoom session has crowded us into a little compartment called a Zoom call that's semi-permeable. We're doing a thing called interconnecting. We're about to have a discussion, and we're recording the session. This is PIM. This is the same process that we're identifying at life's beginning, that is potentially universal, and it's present at all scales. So, and then the last question, if the progenitor had to be a system for shaping probabilistic outcomes and moving the bar of thermodynamic equilibria, then life shapes probability in its favor at all scales. Is this a new explanatory context for our remarkable capacities, including conscious experience? That if life basically is a future probabilistic shaper that really draws events toward it by its very action, what is the philosophical implication of that? What is the cosmological implication of that property? So I'll leave it at that, and want to thank Matt for his partnership over now 4 or 5 years. And these are some of the collaborators and supporters for the science. And this is a way to reach me if you need to. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Bruce. So Matt, I gather you're going to then do some comments off the back of that fascinating talk. So over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Richard, and thanks, Bruce, for laying that all out. It's exciting to see this work develop. I can't believe it's been, gosh, yeah, about 4, almost 5 years that we've been doing this. Let me just take a few minutes here to zoom out and take the cosmological perspective on this empirical hypothesis that Bruce has laid out for us. When I first heard Bruce lay this out, particularly his account of the combinatorial selection that can take place in the wet-dry cycling environment, the progenitor environment, I immediately thought of the cosmology and the philosophy, let's say the philosophical cosmology of Alfred North Whitehead. If any of you are familiar Whitehead has this concept of concrescence, and concrescence is the keystone of his whole metaphysical scheme. It's his way of accounting for how the universe produces novelty. And I see Whitehead's account of concrescence as a general metaphysical description of the very much more specialized process that Bruce is describing to account for the origin of life. I don't have time to get into all the details of Whitehead's account of concrescence, but I want to lay that out there. And Richard was kind enough to share our paper, and you can get into the nuts and bolts of that if you want to by reading it. But to zoom out for a moment, my question as a philosopher is, what is the place of life in the cosmos, and particularly in a cosmos which we know, in light of the inflationary model, is an evolving process. The universe is not a place, it's an event. It's something which is happening, right? And so we speak now in terms of cosmogenesis to capture this notion of the universe as a process of becoming, right? And Whitehead's metaphysics, Whitehead's obviously what major influence on me. He's no longer thinking of the universe in terms of bits of matter floating in empty space through homogeneous time. The universe is made of events or occasions, as Bruce mentioned. And to take a cosmological perspective on life, we have to do more than just what physical cosmology normally does. Physical cosmology treats the universe as a system wherein life is sort of an anomaly. It's a peripheral thing that happens much later in the evolution of the universe. And a physicist, as far as a physicist is concerned, most physicists at least, they don't need to include the possibility of life emerging in their accounts of space, time, matter, and energy, because life is considered a kind of accident, not essential to the physical makeup and organization of the universe. But from a philosophical perspective, that's all backwards, because we need to understand what it is in the nature of things such that there should be any science. Because after all, here we are as conscious organisms emergent from this cosmic evolutionary process, turning back to ask about our own origins, not only as living organisms, but our origins as cosmic beings. And so we need to understand the universe such that it could have given rise to our capacity to understand it. Sometimes this is referred to as the anthropic principle, and then the physicists who do get into this will talk about fine-tuning. I'm sure most of you are familiar with all of these issues. So from a Whiteheadian point of view, there's certainly a lot of emergence going on and certain key transitional moments as you move from physics to chemical selection to proper biological cells, and then eventually to self-reflective animals and human beings with symbolic language and so on. These are thresholds that are crossed that are very important, but in an evolutionary scheme, we wouldn't want to so emphasize these different levels of emergence that they appear to be disjoint from one another. There needs to be some degree of continuity here. And so in Whitehead's scheme, in his attempt to understand the universe in terms of what I've called in the paper a general theory of evolution, generalizing evolution beyond just Darwinian selection, which Bruce and his team have already done in a way by talking about combinatorial selection. It's not yet natural selection in the way that Darwin described it, but it's a generalization from that, which shows how you can get the amplification of complexity and of function even before you have a proper reproducing cell, even before you have templating with DNA or RNA. And so I'm trying to generalize evolution even further. And I've drawn on the work of astronomers like Eric Chason, who's described the evolution of stars and galaxies, much more, the process of selection at work at these astronomical scales is much slower, and it's admittedly more, it's a looser description of a selection process, but nonetheless, Chase then has begun to articulate this and even to offer some quantifications of how we could measure the increases in complexity at the astronomical level. And so with Whitehead's help, I'm trying to generalize our account of evolution so that we can see a continuous process of complexification over the course of the history of the universe, such that life and mind or consciousness are no longer considered to be anomalies or accidents that occur way off on the periphery of cosmic space and time, but that are rather, in some sense, essential to the whole process. Whitehead is a pan-experientialist, which is a version of panpsychism, which is this idea that not that full-blown consciousness goes all the way down. Consciousness emerges, but it emerges from a minimal form of experience, where experience in this minimal form would be just described as that tension that exists between the inheritance of a past and the anticipation of a future, right? And in the case of the simplest forms of matter or energy, an electron, say, what's inherited and what's anticipated, again, very minimal, right? But as you ramp up the scale of complexity, the time depth increases until you get to a human being that we can imagine back to the origin of the universe, or forward to the destiny, maybe the heat death or not of the universe, right? So, pan-experientialism is Whitehead's way of preserving some continuity in this general scheme of evolution, from electrons to E. coli and elephants and human beings. But also, he's an emergentist. He's inheriting what a century plus ago was the thought of this school of the British emergentists, like C.D. Broad and Samuel Alexander and others, who were thinking in these terms way back then. And so the last thing I want to share briefly here, well, I don't have time to do that. I'll share one quote from Whitehead about the importance of rhythm, because this connects to Bruce's emphasis on cycling, right? So in his book, The Function of Reason, Whitehead says that the way of rhythm pervades all life and indeed all physical existence, right? Think of the electromagnetic radiation and its the vibration that propagates these electromagnetic pulses, right? So rhythm pervades all life and indeed all physical existence. This common principle of rhythm, Whitehead continues, is one of the reasons for believing that the root principles of life are, in some lowly form, exemplified in all types of physical existence, right? And so, Bruce was showing us the rotation of the Earth on its axis and the way that this creates a day and night rhythm or cycle. We also have a satellite orbiting us, the moon, which creates tidal rhythms. We have the wet-dry cycling, and life emerges in the interplay and indeed the harmonization of all of these rhythms, which function to promote and amplify complexity. That's the type of universe we live in. And Whitehead's metaphysics is an attempt to account for this, to understand the universe such that life and mind could emerge within it. I want to stop there so that we have time for discussion. There's so much to be said, right? This is a 14 billion year process of evolution. So many interesting facets and details, but I'll leave it there, and hopefully some interesting questions and comments have bubbled up to the surface.
Absolutely. Thank you for that, Matt. Yeah, really, fascinating, and definitely a lot to think about. Can I just kick things off with just one question? So obviously, Whitehead is quite famous for his understanding of God, and seeing God and the world or the universe is very deeply interrelated, and in, I don't know, in a relationship with each other. How, and so I sort of can get my head around the pan-experientialism and this idea of rhythm, and I think sort of this idea that the basic principles of life operate at every level, if I've sort of understood you correctly. Maybe I'm jumbling it a little bit. So where does Whitehead then get, how does God fit into Whitehead's schema? And how does he conceptualize God? And yeah, you probably can't answer that quickly.
If anyone who reads our chapter will notice that I didn't mention God. I do talk about the importance of collaborating with theologians when it comes to questions about the origin of life and the place of life in the cosmos, because even if we don't want religious dogmas or theological ideas to interfere or unduly constrain the sorts of questions that scientists can ask, any scientific hypothesis is going for it to be for it to influence our worldview. It's going to need to enter into dialogue with religion, because human beings are. I mean, maybe this is a controversial statement, but we're religious animals. Even if we are scientifically inclined, when we try to understand the origin of the universe and of conscious life, we're inevitably going to be making myth, right? And so Whitehead's God is a metaphysician's God. He says that, like Aristotle, he's trying to understand as rationally as he can how the universe came to be organized as it is today. And for Aristotle, this philosophical attempt to understand the principles that could have produced a universe like ours led to his conception of God as the unmoved mover. Whitehead says that that's based on a outdated physics. We don't need a source of the origin of motion in the universe. But for Whitehead, we do have an analogous problem, which has to do with the relationship between infinite possibility and finite actuality. And this is, in light of quantum physics, which were just beginning to be formulated in the 1920s when he was writing his major works. And so God comes in for Whitehead as a constraint or limitation upon possibility. And he admits that, it's entirely irrational why there should be a God, but it's entirely irrational why there should be something rather than nothing. You kind of need one free miracle to get the whole thing going. And his one free miracle is to posit a God as a principle of limitation, whereby a finite universe could emerge out of infinite possibility. And God is not something outside the universe for Whitehead. God is in the universe. God is that which provides some sense of relevant novelty to every creature in the universe, such that as we inherit everything which has occurred in the past, we can interpret that experience in a meaningful way and then contribute some relevant novelty for the next moment in the course of events. And so Whitehead describes God as a lure, L-U-R-E, a lure that is his way of explaining why cosmogenesis should move in this direction of increasing complexity. Despite the laws of entropy, there seems to be another principle at play. He described it as a counter-agency, which he thought was empirically evident and observable, that the universe doesn't just run down. There's also this counter-agency at work. So, but this is, again, not a God of religious belief in Whitehead's view. This is a metaphysician's God. So, yeah.
Fascinating, yeah, and very clearly explained. Very good, yeah. Does anybody else want to jump in with any comments, questions? Yeah.
I've got a question here. So you were talking about the wet, dry, hot, cold cycles, whatever. I was the first thing that sprung to my mind is this is also something that happens with coastal regions or estuarine regions. Is there a reason? You may have answered this already, but I'm not sure I could follow everything in detail. Is there a reason why hot springs are a better scenario than coastal or estuarine regions?
Yes, a very good question, Michael, and that one comes up quite a bit. Well, what we determined is that the compartments, the lipid membranous compartments that we can form from meteorite material, which we think are the first encasements for the polymers and the cycling, can't happen in salty water at all. So if you get high divalent cations, it crashes those membranous systems into clumps. And so we've actually gone to the ocean here in Santa Cruz, and we've taken water that we also took from Yellowstone National Park and put all of our lipid panels in there. And sure enough, you can't form compartments. And that's actually a major reason, one of the reasons the field shifted away from the oceans, because not only is it a diluting environment, but the salts block compartment formation. And the content of the ocean actually blocks many prebiotic chemical reactions, such to the point that if you suggested to colleagues around the world that instead of distilled laboratory water, they use seawater, none of them would want to do that because they probably wouldn't be able to get the chemistry to work. And distilled water in the lab is the same as basically distilled water falling from the sky. So life has to adapt to the seashore by pumping out salt with active pores to basically remove those dangerous cations from its interiors. And that's an advanced feature of the living world that had to arise after life's beginning.
Yeah, I guess my follow-up question is, do we know how salty water was back when we expect life to have begun? Because I imagine it would have been possibly less salty than it is now in the oceans. And the other part, I guess, in estuarine scenarios, you don't necessarily, I mean, depending on how far up you are in the estuary, you have different mixing ratios, right? And the mixing processes are quite an interesting complexity as well. Is that not something that could create an interesting scenario, or?
The evidence from our colleagues who study the Paleoarchean and the rocks at the marine shore, it's pretty much similar saltiness back as far as we can get a sample, and a much higher content of iron as well. So the oceans in those years, say the Hadean would have been sort of coffee color or even green effectively. So even more material, which has since precipitated out. So the oceans are a dilute bulk of kind of problematic composition, and so that's the general feeling. And the estuarine environment's a very good point, so that you get these flushes of fresh, and then you get pulses of more saline environment. And truthfully, also in ponds on land, you'll get higher concentration of salt. And what we feel is that from the more fresh, more rainwater fed environments, which are more conducive to the chemistry, proto-life or early life would have had a chance to adapt to higher saline conditions, both in little drying ponds on land, but also then eventually in the estuarine environment, because it was a major barrier. It was, in a sense, there would have been a death front where these kind of pond scum flowing down from more freshwater environments, so it would hit the salty environments, it would have died at that place. And then that's the front, that's the selection barrier that it has to overcome, the hurdle has to overcome. And a very impressive hurdle it is when you reach salty water and you have to adapt to that. So that would have selected for these active pores and probably driven the development of more efficient energy systems too.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. That's very interesting.
Can I ask a little follow-up question, Bruce? But it might be a bit, I guess, beyond your immediate interest. But then because yeah, what you're saying sounds very persuasive. But then it does seem odd that if life evolved on land, and maybe I'm out of date, but my understanding is that all land animals, and indeed most land plants, all land plants, emerged originally in the sea. So it's kind of odd that it did this journey into the sea, even though that was a very difficult thing for life to do, and then it came back on. It sort of seems that why didn't it just stick? Why didn't land animals emerge on land, or why do we have no evidence of that happening? I mean, maybe that's just a bigger question. I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on that? But if not, that
The bits and pieces of evidence are coming together, and one of them about 10 years ago was pretty compelling, that the basic proto-ancestor of all plants emerged as a single-celled form in a freshwater pool on land. So the origin of land plants is not marine algae. And in fact, one has to actually think of things a little different, in that it is the boundary regions between minerals, air, and waters where complexity can happen. So for instance, if we make that argument, if you look at the seashore and you look at basically rivers coming out, you have a lot of nutrients coming from rock weathering, and you have the richest ecosystems at seashores, but also at pond shores, which kind of points back to that as the optimal environment for the living world in terms of evolution and form, and that if you go out further into the ocean, you find a desert. So you find a lack of things to eat. Apart from the phototropic layer in the sort of the upper 3 meters of ocean, it's pretty much a desert. And if you go into the dry landscapes of the Sahara, you find very, very low diversity and low biomass. So really, life, if it emerged on this boundary, its future was in that boundary, whether it was a salty place or a fresh place. And so what we're finding is, say, for instance, the first anneliid worms or the first fungi were in those boundary environments, whether they be salt or fresh. Turns out that plants have an origin on the land. So the origin of animals is thought to have branched off of fungi, that we're kind of we emerged from fungi. So where are fungal emergence happening? Is that happening at the seashore? Is it happening at a lake shore? That's not, there's no evidence one way or the other for that. But it was certainly happening at a margin environment, at a boundary between air, water, and mineral, probably.
fascinating stuff. Emad and Robert. Robert first, and then I think Emad had a hand too, but we'll go Robert and then Emad.
Yes, thank you. That was very interesting. I'm a philosopher, and one of the things I've been very influenced by is the writings.
I can barely hear you, Robert.
Sorry, one of the writings of one of Wittgenstein's pupils, Con Drury, and one of the points that he made, which I think is amazingly pertinent, is that one of the roles of philosophy is to say to scientists, stop speculating. Tell us what you know, what you can show. Because if you don't do that, you are in a wave of speculation, just so stories. And I was very struck also by the biologist R.C. Lewontin. And he was asked on one occasion, could he write something on the subject of the origins of human cognition? And he said he couldn't possibly do it. He wouldn't do it. And the title of his article actually is well worth looking at. It's The Evolution of Cognition, Questions We Will Never Answer. And the reason he said that is because the evidence no longer exists. So we can only speculate, we can only form just so stories. But I was also struck and fascinated by the criticisms of Professor Diamantour, who takes a very skeptical view about the possibility of forming a theory about the origin of life. And I found him extraordinarily convincing. So I remain in the position, maybe it's just as Lewontin said, one of the things we can never know.
Well, I think
Very articulate.
the answer to that is I'm full agreement. We can never exactly know. We can only, in say, for instance, the next decades, establish a plausible hypothesis. But by doing experiment, you know, we have these what are called parallel lines of evidence. So if we take Mars as an example, it's an entombed, preserved world. Mars surface is 2 billion years to 3.5, 4 billion years of age, and there it is. So we can go there, we can see what a planet was like. Little bits of the Earth, we can actually see what the crust was like in Northwest Australia, South Africa, places like that. We can actually, there's exposed crust from 3.5 billion years ago. So we know what the chemical conditions were. We know what the atmospheric condition was because it's like an insect preserved in amber. There it is. And we can also take meteorites that are the age of the Earth that we've either gone out with a spacecraft and sampled or have fallen on the Earth, and we know their age, and we know the composition, so we know it was falling then. So we have these lines of evidence of the actual crime scene, if you will. This is not a guess. This is actual evidence. And then what we do know is that the sun was rotating, there was freshwater rainfall, we know there was volcanism, we can see the evidence of that. We know there were hot springs, we find that. And we know the material going in the hot springs, we can grind up those meteorites like the Murchison meteorite and form membranes. And so the crime scene gets more and more, it's not just an outline of a man, it's now, there's, there's motive and there's a weapon and there's et cetera, and we can actually, from the ground up, and then we go out to hot springs that are equivalent to the ones that we find evidence for, and we try the chemistry from the materials we know are available, and we get these forms occurring. Now, we'll never know the exact, we'll probably know that they were lipid membrane, fatty acid lipid membrane boundaries because it's the only thing available. And we know that there are nucleobases and that there are amino acids on that material. So it's very close. It's very close to a tenable model that's very convincing for our colleagues. And it is the chasm between we can form these starting units and how do we get it up to a living system. And perhaps this is where James Tour, he can't argue. I spent some time with him in Houston about 4 or 5 years ago and found that he's not doing research in our field. He doesn't come to our meetings. And so he hasn't showed up. He hasn't been to Australia to see these outcrops. He's never really done, well, he's never done anything in our field. So he's a critic from outside that is looking for holes and looking for gaps. And as we fill the gaps, then he'll just find more gaps. Perhaps he's a god of the gaps type of a fellow. But he's certainly, his arguments are not convincing because what he leaves out is this massive body of evidence that has emerged. And then we know that combinatorial selection is very powerful. Our colleagues have built systems to evolve functional polymers from starting from random sequences. So all of these powerful converging lines of evidence, he ignores or picks apart individually, but is not doing anything productive in our field. So he's just pretty much ignored. I believe there was a critique done by Professor Dave on his podcast of James Tour a couple of years ago. Some of our colleagues came on that, but we just kind of ignored that. But where the big question is, and this is where the unknown is, the sequence of emergence of functional polymers that have to link together into effectively would be very difficult to do in synthetic biology in the lab. They have to spontaneously emerge and stack, and that system has to replicate, not in a very predictable or specific way, but it has to kickstart. It has to, that engine has to start where you get a biological system out of that. That's an unknown. That's in the realm of speculation. That's work for the next decades.
Absolutely amazes me is how you smart guys in your fantastic labs can't do the stuff which you expect to have emerged under a rock somewhere 4 billion years ago, with goodness knows what kind of interfering agents is operating then and subsequently. But I've got another question, or just one final question. Eugene Kumin, he came up with the calculation, admittedly it was about 10 years ago. He said the probability of all this happening, of life forming, was something like 10 to the minus 1018. And his solution, his argument, this is very, very improbable. And his solution is to move to a many worlds theory as the only means by which one could reasonably expect that to have happened. What I want to ask you is, have you worked out the probability of your own account being a true one?
Well,
why not?
What we do is, so here's a simple example. If you take a gram quantity of lipid, which you can actually render out of egg yolks in one morning, get this little white powder, gram quantity, throw it into a buffered solution, which means that it's an acidic solution. It will break up into 100 billion compartments. So the smallest amount of this material creates this enormous combinatorial explosion. And if those compartments are infused with, say, polymers or organics, when that system dries down, you can look at it under the microscope, you'll see this aggregate mass. That aggregate mass, if it's been cycled a few times, has trillions of polymers in it of different sequences. They're just wet dry cycling. If you do the numbers on that gram quantity, you're talking a very small amount. The complexity of that system that's now in interaction, if things are happening within it, outstrips the complexity of the planet that it lies upon. And this is one of just the sheer numbers of polymers, their sequence, and in a sense their identities, and then the number of compartments. So if a pool should form of more than gram quantities, but a kilogram of this material, you're talking a system that is so complex that it's the most complex thing in the universe, effectively. Just by the fortuitous combination of amphiphilic compounds that form the membranes and get all the building blocks together. So what we're talking about here is it's brand new science, and it's a new concept of what complexity is. And that within this sludge, this ignoble sludge, if you will, can emerge from the inventor's workshop of random parts. It's like Hoyle's tornado going through a junkyard, assembling a 747. You have the combinatorial power in a very small place to do a great deal of emergent phenomena. You have a lot. And so if you look at a planet, you look at a field of hydrothermal pools, the numbers are very large in these membrane aggregate systems. And what we're writing now is a new article for a book that's coming out, which will talk about the progenitor as these aggregate masses, and propose to our colleagues that we resituate all of our experimental studies in these protocell aggregates, because that is where the action is effectively. It's where the combinatorial power is. But I think we have no doubt that the landscape is quite capable of generating highly improbable events, because you're stacking things that emerge that are somewhat improbable. They stack and they accumulate and they create a platform for more improbable events. And if you look at how all that adds up, you see something like the emergence of this of the Krebs cycle, of the citric acid cycle, is no longer implausible at all because it comes from precursors. This is Richard Dawkins' argument, but down at the molecular level, it comes from precursors which were tough but not implausible. And in a system that is so large with so many protocells and so many polymers and so much cycling, they're very likely. So I have no issue with the emergence of life in many places. And if we know of tens of thousands of exoplanets, maybe a few thousand of them are Earthable in their lifetimes, then we have a lot to play with.
You wouldn't put a figure on it then?
Right, good. No, that was really fascinating, Bruce. Robert, I'm just mindful of the time, and it was really
I've had my time.
and it was really good questions, of course. And Bruce, it was one thing I found really interesting was hearing about all the different fields of science coming together, the geology and astrophysics, and it all coming together in this really interesting. So it must be a fascinating field to work in. Emad, I think you had a question. So quick question from Emad, and then I need to dash, so we'll then wrap up. So Emad, over to you.
I typed in the comment section, pond scum and sea cucumber. And this whole thing about these protocells coagulating with each other and communicating, that's like a sea cucumber, right?
Yeah, I can barely hear you, Ahmed, again.
It's like a sea cucumber.
It's like a seeking function, you mean?
Sea cucumber.
Sea cucumber. Looking at the question. Right, I agree with your comments. I think that what we don't need to go to extravagant explanations. I mean, that's the whole basis of how science progresses, and we can stick to parsimonious solutions. And that's what happened when Dave dried a solution down 20 years ago and saw that he could do an amazing amount of chemistry. No chemist had ever done that. No chemist would dry their test tube down. And because they would say, well, why would I dry my test tube down? I've got things in solution. I'm just going to take an aliquot out and I'm going to do a serial enrichment. But drying down turns out to be a superpower in chemistry. So it's a parsimonious solution, a simple, non-extravagant solution that changed everything in this type of chemistry. But I'm trying to see if you have a specific question. The comments are wonderful.
Do you want to type out the question, Emad?
I already did.
Oh, okay. Oh, okay. You were just asking whether it was like, I
don't think we need to posit in infinite universes to explain an origin of life in a hot spring pool. I think we can go to the pool and try it out and get the real numbers.
Yeah, okay. I mean, I know we're running out of time, but Robert's question just got me thinking. The many worlds hypothesis is so extravagant. I don't think it should count as science anymore. It's more like metaphysics, and it's bad metaphysics, I could say, as a metaphysician, because positing infinitely many universes to explain the organization we see in this universe is, as Bruce said, not very parsimonious. But when it comes to estimating the probability for the emergence of life, I mean, that probability is changing with each new emergent layer of self-organization in the history of the universe. There's not just one probability. When we take on board Whitehead's cosmology, we're not dealing with just, as Jacques Monod might say, chance and necessity. We're dealing with habit and novelty instead. And when, the first electrons and protons form atoms, and the atoms form stars, and stars form galaxies, the probability that life will then emerge later is increasing because the environment is becoming more complex such that it can support the emergence of life eventually, which is the key to Bruce's insight about the origin of life. We're looking for the environment that could shelter this space wherein what would seem improbable just in the abstract becomes increasingly more probable as the conditions are right, as the rhythms are present, as the cycling ramps up. And so I think there's a lot of confusion about the way this whole question about how probable or improbable is life is being framed. And it's reconfigured in a Whiteheadian context, I think. But so much more to say. I know we don't have time right now.
Excellent. Well, I'm really sorry, everybody. I'm going to have to dash off. So I will very briefly say goodbye to our YouTube viewers, and then we can part ways and exchange emails if anybody's got any further follow-up questions and stuff. But YouTube viewer, thanks for joining us. I hope you found that interesting. I know I did. Massive thanks to Bruce and Matt for a fascinating talk. I thought it was really interesting, a lot to think about, and I definitely learned a lot. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like and subscribe for more videos like this. I think we have another one next month at some stage, so stay tuned for that. But either way, I shall look forward to seeing you in the next video. All right, take care.
All right, cheerio.
Thanks, Richard.